Go. Okay, we're going to continue our discussion with how do the Agile principles apply to the delivery horizon. See the whole. Okay, this is about a shared understanding. This is about making sure that the entire project team, the entire iteration team, has a common understanding of the particular pieces that we're going to be working on in this particular iteration, and how these how these pieces contribute to the value that the product is going to bring to the stakeholders. It's also that we need to be mindful of the fact that the delivery horizon is only a small piece of the overall picture, and that the information that is derived from the work that we're doing in the delivery horizon goes back to inform the initiative and strategy horizons, so that we're delivering value appropriately. This is that we understand the values, so we prioritize the backlog items according to what's going to provide the best increment of value going forward, and that we have the items sequenced properly so that our product will continue to work and continue to grow as we add more functionality to it. Think as a customer. Well, this is in each increment that we're doing, each piece of delivery that we're doing, each user story we're working on, involves a customer of some sort, a user who will be trying to do something, and so we need to be continually looking at this from the perspective, both when we're putting together information to go to the delivery horizon or to add an item to the delivery horizon. We want to be sure that we're mindful of how this is going to impact on our customers. Okay. And this is can be used a lot. This is where personas can come into to the evaluation of what's going on. That's a technique that allows us to align what we're doing with a specific representation of our customers, and so we can use those and ensure that they align properly. I mentioned yesterday the possibility of segmenting your user population based on personas, and we can see as we're delivering specific user stories, if we understand how those user stories impact our various personas, the level to which they impact them, then that can help us to determine where the value is going to be delivered for any particular increment. Analyze to determine what is valuable. Here we're talking again about feedback, about basically prioritizing, maintaining our backlog. This is, I find myself repeating myself a lot in this, but these are the key core things. It's feedback, and what are we doing with this feedback? We're using it to prioritize the backlog. We're using it to determine whether or not anything has to change in the initiative. We're using it to determine whether or not we're achieving our strategic goals. We talked a bit about about the process as a part of this, and constantly assessing. Oh, sorry. Right outside my window is a road, and somebody has decided that it's time to have a party in the road here. So sorry about that. Get to listen to the cars driving by. Usually fairly quiet around here, but this one just happened to jump into my hearing. So anyway, We're talking about assessing, we're using feedback to assess both the product that we're delivering, which is the actual deliverables, and the process that we're using to do our work and do our deliverables. And we need to be using feedback, valid feedback, to assess both those aspects and determine where, what parts of our process are valuable, what parts are moving the initiative forward, and what, if any, parts are impeding the initiative or not adding value. The whole idea of value is something that, basically the way people have, or the way a lot of people have looked at value is what would the customer be willing to pay for? If the customer is not willing to pay for it, then you have to question whether or not it's valuable. That's a little bit of a generalization. There are times, there are regulatory requirements, constraints in the business that mean things have to be done, even though they don't directly contribute to customer value. But the idea of would the customer pay for it is a really kind of a good way of looking at things. Um, back in the day when I had my BA team, one of the things that I said to them at a number of points in time when we were talking about our own performance and our own deliverables, I said, one of the things that should be in the back of your mind is looking at your requirements documents, your requirements artifacts, and saying, how much did it cost me to produce this, and would somebody pay for it? That can be an enlightening kind of thing if you think about that for a little while, to say, is my work really valuable? Does it would somebody, if I were on the market for this, if I needed this, would I pay for it, and how much would I pay for it? Those kinds of questions. And they're the kinds of questions that we should always be asking as a part of a delivery team. Are we delivering value, and is our process delivering value? And obviously, we're looking at taking the feedback that we have and applying it to specifically to the backlog and to user stories, so that we refine our user stories as we need them. Okay. The picture on the right is nice because it is always a circle. It's always about until we finally deliver something, we're constantly going to be refining it, discussing it, adding more information to it, analyzing that information, refining the information, sharing and discussing the information, and that keeps going until we're satisfied that we've got it right. The Agile extension and the IIBA has a couple of kind of benchmark questions. I like benchmark questions. I think I mentioned earlier that in terms of business analysis, one of the questions about evaluating initiatives, evaluating projects, that we should be able to answer is, how will we know when we're done, and how will we know when we're successful, or how will we know if we've been successful? Two simple questions. Here, about in terms of evaluating the process, and this is probably extremely relevant at the delivery horizon, because this is where a lot of the team is involved, perhaps more so than at the other horizons. Here is where we're really focused on the actual delivery team, and they have these series of 5 questions that say, okay, when we're looking at feedback for our delivery process, for the way we develop things at the delivery level, is what we're doing making our team happier? That's an interesting that's really an interesting thing, and I'm happy to see this here, honestly. I worked in an environment where my boss used to be very fond of saying work shouldn't be fun. That always annoyed me, and is probably one of the reasons why I'm not there anymore, is because it wasn't fun. It got to the point where it was not fun, and his goal was always, you shouldn't be making your team happy, you should be making your team productive. My impression was always that happy people are productive people. If I can help to make my team happier, they will likely be putting forth more energy and more effort to do the job well. Here in the agile paradigm, one of the questions that they're saying is the team happier? Um, are we are we mitigating defects? Are we not producing defects? Are we being more efficient? Are we getting things done better and faster? Um, Getting things done better and faster is our velocity increasing? Another kind of just a plus and a minus in that what we need to achieve really is a consistent velocity that our team can maintain. If we get to the point where we understand this is the amount of work that we can do and we're okay with that, um, we shouldn't necessarily be beating ourselves up and saying, well, we have to be moving faster. We have to be moving faster. I think the thrust of this particular question is, have we made some changes? Not because we want to increase velocity, but have we made some changes and have those changes resulted in increased velocity? If they have, then they're probably a good thing. But that should not be something that we should be looking at and saying we have to improve our process to improve our velocity. That's, that balancing act. Um, if we're thinking about doing something, if we're thinking about changing something, um, you know, what are we going to get from changing that something? Uh, we shouldn't just do things because we want to change them. We should have an idea of what the goal is. This feeds back to my premise about strategic goals, that frequently, as organizations, if our strategy isn't clear and isn't well defined, we wind up doing things because somebody thinks we should do them, as opposed to somebody has determined that we will benefit from doing them. So even at the at the delivery horizon level, when we're talking about our specific processes, we should be expecting something. If we're going to make a change, we should be expecting some positive benefit from making that change. And because we're working in an environment where the team is an important, it's an important entity. It's an entity that really is driving everything. What we should be looking at is what's valuable and important to the team. We need to agree that this is not about my decision. It's about the team's decision. We are a group, and we need to have a feeling of consensus about what we're doing. Get real using examples. Clearly, when we're looking at user stories, we want to be very specific in terms of developing acceptance criteria, that they are things that can be clearly measured, they're clearly understood, and they are specifics that can actually be looked for so that we can answer these questions as yes or no. That's the overall goal with acceptance criteria, is that ultimately the answer has to be yes. In some cases it will be good enough, but there needs to be some sort of clear sort of yes or no kind of thing that we can be looking at. And the clearer that we can be about these things, obviously, when we're explaining things and putting things together, the clearer and more definite we can be about these things, the greater the likelihood that we're all going to understand what we're trying to achieve. Going back to that comic that was out there several slides ago, we can have as many discussions as we want, but if we don't all have the same understanding, if we are not all in agreement of what we're doing, what we're talking about, we're going to have misunderstandings and we're going to go down wrong roads. Uh, One of the things that I think frequently does not get implemented in organizations to the level that it needs to get implemented, and in initiatives to the level that it needs to get implemented, are glossaries. Terminology. Terminology can be, there can be widely ranging differences in the understanding of terms. I know when I was operating in the healthcare environment, our company had several different healthcare products. And the products operated somewhat independently. They had their own, although the overall goal was to provide services to members. There was a lot of variation in that. And one of the things that we had a problem with that surfaced itself was people's conception of what a member was. There was not a common understanding, and because there wasn't a really, a common glossary that people were used to using. There was a glossary that we had, but nobody focused on it. Everybody just sort of glossed over it and thought that it was another one of those things of, oh yeah, well, we have to have a glossary. Sure, we have a glossary, but we all understand all of these things. And there was not a realization that we didn't all understand all of these things. We had significant debates. I can remember significant debates, particularly between the IT team and the business team regarding the definition of a claim in the insurance industry. You would think that a claim would be something that everybody would say, oh yeah, we all know what a claim is. And yeah, they all said we know what a claim is. And then when they started talking between the business users and the IT users, they had a different definition of what constituted a claim. And this became a point of contention. The same way that members became a point of contention between different products. So this is something where you really have to, as an organization, say, we have this reference set of terminology, and everybody has to accept that when anyone uses one of these terms, unless they specifically say, I'm using this term differently than the organization generally uses it, this is the accepted definition of this term or this acronym. We had the same thing true with acronyms. Acronyms, particularly between the business users and the technology users, were just crazy because IT has its own set of acronyms, and if you've ever done an acronym search on the internet, you can type in any number of letters as an acronym and you will get anywhere from one to several, if not many different definitions of different acronyms. It's funny, I just was yesterday looking on YouTube. I wanted to back check on some of the on my previous iterations of this class. And I went to YouTube and did a search for AAC. And all of a sudden there were all of these other things that were acronyms for AAC that had nothing to do with Agile certification. It was just, okay, a ton of other things that were out there. And this is, obviously that was a much more general environment, but even in specific environments, you'll find the same kind of thing is true, that people have different understandings. So being as specific as you possibly can, to being sure that we all have the same understanding of what we're talking about and what specifically we're dealing with. using examples to illustrate that, it goes a long way. Understanding what is doable. This is always up for grabs. Obviously, the optimal situation is that we never undertake to do something. We never undertake to put something into a specific iteration, into a specific sprint, unless we believe that it is doable. Um, you know, we're probably not always going to succeed at that, but we always have to be willing to look at what we've got in the backlog and even what we've got in our sprint to determine if we've come up with something that it turns out is not doable. Um, Ideally, as I said, we want to identify that before we start work on something, and that means we need to ensure that we have the appropriate level of detail about our user stories when we choose to look at them and work on them. But you know, there's always a possibility that we get to a certain point and understand that something is not particularly doable, and we need to be able to assess that and respond to that as rapidly as possible and as honestly as possible. I know I certainly, my own self, have overestimated what I was capable of, in terms of people saying, "Can you do this?" "Oh, sure, I can do this." And then when I start to look at doing it, I say, yeah, I didn't realize who knew this was going to be so complicated, or who knew this was going to be so problematic, or who knew any of a variety of other things that make it impossible. So you always want to have a focus on understanding and verifying what you can actually do. Um, Comes down to refining and prioritizing stories, and it comes down to collaborating with your stakeholders to look at both your stories and your process and be realistic about it. Stimulate collaboration and continuous improvement. Well, this is because we've got a lot of the members of the team operating at this horizon. It's very detailed work. This is almost on a daily basis. We've got to be communicating and collaborating with various members of the team and various stakeholders in order to ensure that we continue to move forward. And we want to at this point be basically refining and honing our collaboration skills so that we are continuously communicating with each other and basically looking at things, consistently looking at things. Um, Interesting, nice little picture on the right hand side of the screen. Collaboration involving all of these different aspects of interacting with people in order to support the efforts that we're making to move forward. Trust is a big one here for teams. We have to be able to trust that all of the people that are involved in our initiative are working towards the same goal, working towards not that I get my job done, but that we get our job done. This is key, certainly, to the whole agile paradigm, that we don't own our individual tasks. I mean, we do own our individual tasks, but how well we achieve our individual tasks is only a component to how well our team achieves its tasks. And the whole goal of the agile paradigm is to move away from the idea of "I got mine done" to the "we need to get ours done." we should all be, celebrating when we as a team achieve something. We should be celebrating as a team when each individual member of the team achieves something, accomplishes something. This should be a plus for the team, and we really can't have to get out of the mindset of, well, I got my job done. I got my job done. Uh, it always needs to be in the context of, did this move the team forward? Did I help to get the team to get its job done? And last but not least, we're into avoiding waste. How do we avoid waste at the delivery horizon? Well, it goes back to selecting stories that are selecting items for work that are going to provide the highest level of value, selecting stories that are necessary, so that if we're looking at foundational kinds of things, we don't select stories that rely on the foundation having not established the foundation. We have to be able to realistically assess how our stories all fit together, how our backlog items fit together, so that we can deliver value, and then we choose items to work on that are going to deliver the maximum amount of value available, and push things down if they're not more important. Um, nice avoiding waste is by maximizing the work that's not done. We need to spend some time determining what we can eliminate, what we can avoid doing. How can we avoid doing things that ultimately are going to result in no value being added, or result in the possibility that we have to go back and readdress them. Um, this is a point where perhaps it makes a lot of sense, even in the agile environment, to ensure that you have an appropriate level of documentation specifically in terms of decisions that are made. I have found over the long haul that frequently project teams will not uh, confirm and document decisions that are made, and the net result is that the decision is made over and over and over and over again, where there is not a clear shared understanding across the project team. There will be instances where decisions will again come up for debate because somebody on the team doesn't quite agree with the decision that was made, and if that decision was not clearly basically documented and confirmed, that there will be well, I didn't agree to that, or I didn't think that we decided that kind of thing. These are things to be wary of and mindful of, and making sure that your process um, basically supports the idea that if a decision is made, we all agree to that decision and we all accept that decision, and we accept that we will not be just going back and saying, well, I want to talk about that decision again. Now, on the reverse side of that, obviously, if there is more information, new, more valid information that could inform or make us choose to readdress that decision, we should be open to that in terms of feedback and learning. But we need to be careful that it's not just because somebody didn't agree with what we decided. And that's about it for the slides for this section.
No. All right, Tom. So can you just go back again one slide?
Sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So I'm just looking at the second bullet point.
Avoid.
Avoid wastes
Yep.
by maximizing the work not done. Can you explain that with some context?
Oh, with some context. Well, the specific context is if we, um, I'll explain it in a not quite agile context, but I think this will make sense. One of the projects that I worked on, it was a big project. We produced a business requirements document that was about 600 pages long. And we all knew that nobody was ever going to read this document, but it was there. We had to do it because that was our process. We were mandated to produce the business requirements document. It was a large project. The business requirements document was 600 pages long. We knew that nobody was going to read it. What we should have done was to say, how do we elicit the requirements and how do we deliver those requirements in a format that would allow for them to be effectively and efficiently communicated and consumed by our users. We did a lot of work that didn't need to be done. Um, you know, and we didn't do a lot of work that needed to be done. So what you're looking at is, maximizing the work not done. In the agile context, we talked a lot about not refining stories, not getting the full level of detail on a story until it's absolutely necessary to have that level of detail. If you do that, if you get that level of detail too far in advance and something changes, you have managed to do a lot of work that ultimately does not provide any value because you're going to have to go back at it and redo it. So maximizing the amount of work not done is just looking at the things that you're doing and saying, is this the right thing for me to be doing at the right time to the right level of detail? Selecting stories for selecting your stories for an iteration. If you manage to not select them effectively and choose stories for your iteration that don't necessarily provide a lot of value, you're detracting from doing work on stories that could have provided more value. You may have an entire backlog full of stories, and as you go forward, if you choose the stories, if you prioritize the stories and choose the stories properly, you may get 50%, 70% of the stories done and look at the value that you've derived from your product and say, you know what? We don't need to do any more. We've achieved our goal. We achieved our goal with three-quarters of the stories that we had initially identified. We don't need to do that extra 25% of the stories. That would be basically wasted work. So you want to be constantly mindful of when you're doing things, as are those things going to be adding value to your process or to your product, or are they just churning? And you want to be identifying as many of those things as possible and saying, you know what, I'm not going to do these. They're not helping. They're not going to be useful. I'm not going to do them. As you can carve out those things, then you're maximizing the work that you don't do. Okay, is that helpful? Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Okay. So we've come to the end of the slides for the delivery session. So we'll end the show and put this guy away. Um, I want to switch over. Actually, let's go to the AAC study. This is the AAC study guide, and it talks a little bit about specifically the techniques that are involved at the delivery horizon. So I wanted to spend some time going through them. Um, we did spend a bunch of time on user stories. Is there anything about user stories that you guys would like to talk about? Because I think that they're probably one of the techniques that is the most familiar to people in, even people who have not done Agile, but people who have studied Agile or heard about Agile. User stories are something that is one of the core principles or core techniques.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Sorry, Leon.
Yep.
Is there a, I mean, a particular way or like recommended to carry out story point estimation, like what the developers do? Because or is it just arbitrarily done, like they just put a time and think this is what based on, because some of what happens that I witnessed during feature or user story presentations is after you've discussed the what the user story is meant to deliver and the acceptance criteria, and then you begin to, sometimes some deal with man hours, man days, person man days, and while some other people deal with story point estimation. And those, a particular team likes doing story point estimation, and but I always feel like they do it arbitrarily because they don't put any yardstick. They just tell you, okay, I think this can happen like 2 days, or this can take 1 week. But what is there any standard around that, or what do you think? What can you tell me from your experience?
The answer to that question is no. It's a conceptual thing, and you're really talking. You're actually talking about relative estimation, and relative estimation is one of the core agile techniques. It's one that frequently gets misconstrued, and if you look at relative estimation, you'll see that one of the limitations of relative estimation is that people have a tendency to try to assign um, assign these values, hours and days, to stories, and that's not the point of relative estimation. Certainly not the point of story points. The idea of relative estimation and story points is for the team to determine, um, in the context that they're working, the relative size of the chunks of work that they are looking at. So each team, if you've done story points or if you've used story points, generally they run on Fibonacci series. So everybody has their planning poker cards that all have the same numbers on them, and everybody uses these things. But there is not a specific definition, a broad definition that says this is what a one is. When you're using these things, it's up to the team to say only a one is smaller than a two, which is smaller than a three, which is smaller than a five, which is smaller than an eight. And our goal as a team is to all, as a team, agree we all think this for us is an eight. If we look at our story backlog, we say, okay, um, we've got a half a dozen stories and we have one eight and we have one one and we have a bunch of threes and fives. And that probably makes sense. Um, you know, there's probably one story that we all agree is going to be difficult or complicated to achieve, and that one is there as this is an eight, and we've got a bunch of trivial stories or that we've decomposed into really small chunks, and we agree that the way we've carved these stories up, these are all basically straightforward things that we can do. These are all ones. So the key here is that it's always about relative sizes. It's always about, is this more complicated or less complicated, more difficult or less difficult than, we're always comparing uh, items to try and determine their relative sizes. It is specific to the team. Nobody should try to say in an agile environment, this is what the organization defines as a one or a three or a five. It has to be specific to the team, and it should not be translated into, well, a one is 4 hours. You know, that's just not the way it's intended to work, and it's the way it gets misapplied all too frequently. Okay. The other
Okay.
the other interesting option for doing relative estimation, there's a technique, and I actually forget what the name of the technique is, but what it is that as a team you select all of your stories and you put them on post-it notes, and the team basically collaboratively and collectively, without discussing things, basically lines them up in a single line across a wall that is intended to be smallest to largest. And the way it's been implemented, the way I've seen it implemented, is that you uh, have a pile of sticky notes that are sitting on the side of the wall, and each person individually, one item at a time, is supposed to take one of the sticky notes off of the pile and place it on a line, a horizontal line across the wall as to where they feel that story fits in relation to all of the other stories that are on the line. And you can either take a story off the pile, or you can go to the line and pick up one of the stories and move it in relation to the other stories. And the goal is that ultimately you get a single line across the wall, that the team says, okay, based on the stories that we're dealing with, whether it's the stories for this sprint or whether it's the stories for a chunk of our backlog, this is what we agree as a team, going from left to right, are the smallest story to the largest story. That's the whole concept of relative estimation. It's one of the techniques that gets used to basically deal with the work. Probably, I want to say more at the planning or the initiative horizon for larger stories, and more at the delivery horizon for smaller stories. And you could probably do the same kind of thing with tasks, although tasks tend to be, I need to do this task in before I can do this next task. Tasks tend to be more sequential than based on sizes. Although tasks you could sequence and then say I need to assign a size, an objective size to each task, so that you say at the task level, this task is going to take me 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours to do. At that level, it makes sense. At the story point level, you should not be if you're translating, if somebody's translating your story points into either effort levels or, God forbid, date lines, you have a problem. You have a problem with the way people are understanding the way the process is supposed to work. Okay. Any specific questions about user stories that you want to deal with? No? Yeah. I think the big key, honestly, I think the big key with user stories is understanding that a user story doesn't give you everything that you need in order to be able to develop an implementation for the user story, that you really need more information to support that user story, particularly acceptance criteria. I think this is an area where probably most teams would benefit from doing more analysis. uh, not accepting the idea that, oh, we all understand what that user story means. No, it's about you as a user who are responsible or a source, the source for that user story, need to explain to me how you will verify or validate that we have accomplished what you said you have proposed for us to accomplish in the context of that user story. So that acceptance criteria are probably a bigger place to focus than just user stories. Just focusing on user stories, the statements of user stories will probably result in a lot of problems if the acceptance criteria are not clearly laid out and clearly understood. Okay. This is just the mechanics of doing user story, creating user story cards with a couple of examples. And as I said, that I, the the initial iterations of a user story are intended to provide just the basics to start to refine and understand better what the user story really means, so that the team should be having conversations between the delivery people and the business people to refine and understand exactly what is intended by the statement. And confirmation acceptance criteria again, help to validate so that the people who are testing your solution can specifically validate this. There are two sides to this. I think that ultimately the goal is that a user story needs to be validated by a business user, that their value has been achieved. This goes back to the classic kind of you know, in a more siloed, more waterfall environment where you have developers and you have quality assurance people and you have user acceptance people, and sometimes the uh, the paradigm is implemented such that uh, the organization assumes that the quality assurance people are the ones who are going to validate that the business value has been achieved, and that's another fallacy that organizations sometimes suffer from. If you have a quality assurance function in your organization, in your environment, the quality assurance function really should be verifying that the the technical aspects of the solution function the way they are intended to function. I've always said that a QA team should be determining whether or not they can break the solution, not whether or not the solution does the job. The whether or not the solution does the job is really the purview of the business people. And so you've got this two-part paradigm of, can I break it, can I do my job? And there really are two separate functions that are responsible for making those determinations. Acceptance criteria from the user stories should really be about the business value that is going to be you know, put forth to the users. They should be testing things in the context of business tasks, and not necessarily focusing on whether or not the specific functionality generates errors or does does things that are a bit weird. That should be basically determined by the delivery team testing function. Okay. Um, Strengths of user stories. Uh, they're pretty commonly understood. Certainly the statement of a user story, if you accept the idea of that the goal of a user story is to accomplish a specific task for a specific reason. Um, that conceptually makes it pretty easy to understand what user stories are about. Because you have to develop these things and discuss these things with your actual business users. It does promote a bonding between the team, as opposed to doing requirements elicitation, where a business analyst sits with a bunch of business people and says, "Tell me your requirements," and writes down a bunch of requirement statements and then hands them to the development team and says, "Okay, go forth and build me something that meets all of these requirements." The goal here is to get the business people operating closely with the development team. Um, you can do them at almost any level. Actually, you can do them at any level. Um, you could theoretically, at the strategy level, write super high level user stories. I think probably classically those would come down as sort of themes, would be the way they would be defined. It's probably not done. I certainly haven't ever seen anybody do a user story at the organization level, but you could. As an organization, I want to introduce a new product so that I can improve my market penetration. That's a properly formulated user story at the strategic level. Um, you know, So you could conceivably do that, uh, drilling down further to certainly to epics. You could, that would be the first place where they would start to be more readily used, and you can do that. And then certainly at the detailed level, when you take a specific component, you can write user stories that go down to a very detailed level, and that's totally and completely acceptable. You write them at any level that you need to write them. Um, and you process them at any level that you need to process them. The same things are true. The user story is a starting point for conversations. Even at the strategic level, you can say, "Okay, we need to talk about this, and we need to have specific criteria that say, how will I know that I've achieved my goal, the goal of this user story?" So all of it makes sense. It just, it's not anything. It's not anything that's incomprehensible. This is all about, the appropriate level of detail at the appropriate time, and you're using basically the same technique at three different horizons. Um, One of the interesting debates that has gone on ad nauseum, and I think it's probably a useless debate, is user stories versus use cases. There are some people that have said they want to be agile purists and we shouldn't use use cases, we should only use user stories. And there's been a constant debate about, well, are user stories a reflection of use cases, or are use cases a reflection of user stories? And the answer is whatever works. If you're going to be didactic about it, you're going to run yourself into a problem. Just accept the fact, if you're used to using use cases, you can use use cases. You can migrate the use cases to user stories appropriately and operate in an agile environment. Uh, there's no reason that you could not theoretically do agile development based on use cases. As I said, they can translate pretty readily back and forth. If you've got your use cases written properly, they can translate pretty readily back and forth into user stories. They don't have to. You should do the same kinds of questions that you would for a user story. If you have a requirement statement, a classic requirement statement, or a use case step, you should be able to say to your users, how will I verify that this has been successful? How will I verify that you can successfully do this? It's the same kind of thing as writing a user story and saying, how will I verify that you've been able to do this successfully? So really, you're doing a lot of the same stuff, different format, different style, but the goal is the same thing. You need to determine what needs to be done, how it's going to be done, and how you're going to verify or validate that it's been done. Limitations on using user stories. Obviously, they're meant to be used, or they are generally used in a paradigm where we're talking about just-in-time delivery as opposed to predictive delivery, so that if you're working with this paradigm, you don't have all of the details up front. You don't have a lot of the level of detail that you might have if you did a full predictive planning kind of thing. As I mentioned earlier, you do have the opportunity, if you have an environment where you know that things are not going to change, you could still use the user story paradigm and you could derive the level of detail that you need. You could derive the specific level of detail that you need upfront and have it available. No magic to that. Uh, if you break your stories down too much, you can have too many stories, and that can make your prioritization difficult. Again, a balancing act. It's just a possibility to be aware of. Whatever works for your team. If you find that you can't reprioritize your backlog, if you find that there are just too many items that you're dealing with, then you might want to say, I think we've got too many, we're trying to deal with too many stories at the same time, and you might want to even break your stories down into chunks, and look at, okay, should we just put some of these, just make an arbitrary cutoff and put some of these below the line that we simply won't deal with them. We'll chunk this out slightly differently. Um, User stories and backlog items. In general, you have to make sure that you're always mindful of how they interrelate and how they're moving around. So you are going to have to spend time on this. It is something that is necessary, and you just need to be aware that sometimes it can be overwhelming, and you need to balance that. You need to spend the appropriate amount of time to make sure that things are prioritized, but not get yourself bogged down in the details so that you're spending too much time. Um, Very possible that because a lot of what you're doing is breaking down things into smaller and smaller chunks and working on them in terms of smaller and smaller chunks, that sometimes your team can lose sight of the overall vision. And so you just have to be mindful of that and say, at the delivery horizon, we're talking about a small chunk, but that small chunk always fits into the initiative horizon, which is our overall product. And that overall product always fits into our strategy so that we're mindful of the overall organization goals. Um, just something about putting all of this stuff together and keeping it all in a nice, you know, mm, um, in a well traced kind of situation, so that you know how things tie together. Okay. And this last one, which I think is interesting, is overlooking the why and focusing on the what. Um, the why should always be there, because at some point you want to be able to ask and say, are we meeting? If we're not doing this for a specific purpose, should we be doing this at all? And that if you focus on the what, it's pretty easy to say somebody told me to do this, so I'm doing it. If I never ask why I'm doing it, then we have the potential for wasting a lot of time. This was specifically something. It's kind of one of the ways that I got personally involved with doing business analysis, because I used to be a developer when I first started doing technical work. I was doing web development, and my boss, or the second boss that I wound up working for, said to me, you always want to understand why we're doing this stuff. Everybody else is like, just tell me what code I have to write. Tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. And you're one of the few people in this organization that wants to know why we're doing these things. And that resonated really well with me. It also fed into my engineering background, which is another one of my aspects. But it was like, why is this being done? You know, and so that led me into becoming very fond of doing business analysis, because I felt like, somebody should be asking these questions. Uh, and it seemed like the BA function was the right place for that to be happening. Um, so it was a nice interface for me. Relative estimation is, we spent a bunch of time talking about this, that it does basically take things and try and put them into a scale that makes sense for the team. Anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of relative estimation?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Silent sizing was the other technique, or the other element of this technique that I was talking about. You know, planning poker requires that you have planning poker cards, and you kind of there are, I don't know, I've heard of people gaming the system and working all around the idea of planning poker. Um, just things to be mindful of, that there are ways that people will try and game the system if you're doing planning poker, and that defeats the whole purpose of the idea. The idea is for the team to come to a consensus about things. If you have a good solid team that trusts each other and works well together, works well with each other, then you probably won't experience a lot of this. But if your team is not as mature as it could be, you'll find that people will automatically go into ways of kind of gaming the system. The nice thing about relative estimation is that it takes a team to do it, and the goal is that the team come to a conclusion that they can all agree on. It's always possible for us to get it wrong, you know. I mean, things change on the team. Uh, since a lot of this is based on the delivery team, you can get into kinds of debates between the delivery team and the business team. This again depends on the strength of your team, the strength of the trust between your team members. I know that it's frequently the case where um, business users will underestimate the complexity or the difficulty of doing certain things. They will look at it and say, well, that's simple. You just do this, where there are underlying technical constraints that they may not understand, underlying technical difficulties that may be there that they may not understand. And you need to try and kind of, be aware of those kinds of things, and make sure that everybody understands that the decisions that are made by the technical team in terms of the complexity and difficulty of doing things are things that the business users need to trust. They need to trust that the technical team has some knowledge or understanding that they may not. Caveat to that is that I certainly have worked in environments where the business users were very technically savvy, were really, understood the underlying systems, understood them very well, some of them to the point of really being able to be technical experts on the system. And so, it was a little harder to arbitrarily say to those users, well, trust me, we have to do this. We have to do this way. Um, that's just something to be aware of. If you have that level of technological understanding in your organization, uh, they should understand the constraints of the technology, but they may not be always swayed by the technology constraints. So, and the again, talking about relative estimation here, there is a tendency for people to try and take this relative estimation and use it to develop a timeline for delivery, which is not its intent and will cause you a potential problem. And looking at also stakeholders looking on output instead of outcome. They really should be looking at, are we going to be able to do the job that we need to do, and not, are we going to get the tool that somebody said that we were going to get. Okay. Story decomp. Story decomposition is just making sure that we have the appropriate level of detail at the appropriate time, and as we're decomposing stories, that they continue to align to desired outcomes. You want to, the idea would be that in terms of developing a backlog, you want to be kind of keeping at the appropriate level of detail, so that at the initiative horizon, you want to be focusing on more on epics, identifying the epics, the high level functionality, the high level components that you are going to have to deliver, and then trust that as you go further forward, as you get into the delivery horizon, you're going to have to break those stories apart into smaller stories, so that the delivery team can actually have concrete things that they're trying to deliver, and they can deliver in terms of um, concrete pieces. Okay. There's a nice, and it says right here, decomposing to the lowest level of detail is wasteful if you're too early in the game. And this pyramid looks really nice in terms of how you should be looking at this. Saying I don't need this lower level of associated documentation when I'm trying to define my solution. I need to be able to look at it and say, where am I in terms of this pyramid, um, defining what I need, what level of detail I need, so that I don't really need acceptance criteria until I've identified stories. And again, this is more about when do I need it, not when do I have it. Uh, Certainly down to even associated documentation. You may have the associated documentation for a user story very early on in the game. That's fine if you have it. Understand that there's always a possibility that it could change. Um, but if you have it, appreciate the fact that you have it. It means that you may not have to do it when you get down to that level of detail, but understand that you don't need it until you get down to the appropriate level of detail. The idea of story decomposition is so that you don't go down to the down too far in the level of detail until you need to get there. And if you understand that you're going to be continually evolving and basically going for greater levels of details, then if you accept that, if your organization accepts that and your team accepts that, then you won't go down rabbit holes. You'll be mindful of what level of detail you're supposed to be at what particular point in time. Helps you to keep the higher level objectives in mind. If you're not drilling down into things too early, then the likelihood is that you can keep the project goals and objectives in mind. And basically carving things up allows you to basically build a better roadmap, so that you can actually plan your chunks and say, as I get down into a greater level of detail, I can start to align these chunks a little bit better with my roadmap. I love this, the anti-pattern of saying we're doing story decomposition and basically just saying, using that as a way to get into the level of detail early on, too early on. And so I think that in terms of being able to do story decomposition, the key point here is to make sure that you're always aware of what level of detail do I need, not what level of detail can I get to. So, don't go, just be aware not to go into decomposition too early, because you create the potential for waste and rework. Okay. Story elaboration, different from story decomposition. Story elaboration is about getting to the details of the story, of a specific story, in order to be able to deliver that story. Story decomposition, just about breaking larger stories down into smaller stories. Elaboration being where we start to build, particularly the acceptance criteria. This is the technique that we're going to need to use to get the appropriate level of detail for the delivery horizon. We should have already decomposed the story to a sufficient level of detail that we can say this particular story represents a chunk of work that we feel we can handle for this particular iteration. And now we need to be sure that when we work on this story, we have the appropriate level of detail and the acceptance criteria in place so that we'll know um, how we're being successful, how we're going to determine whether or not we're successful at this. Okay. This is where your most detailed requirements come out, is in story elaboration. And it really says that story decomposition is a part of story elaboration, that it's a necessary element. Um, okay. Some things to be looking at in terms of what are we looking for at this particular point in time. Specific task definitions, specific examples and scenarios. This is where, I'm thinking in terms of if you had a user story that says in a retail environment, as a user, I want to pay for my order so that my product can be delivered. And that's a sort of a high level user story. It's something that you could conceive of to work on, and you might say, as a part of your acceptance criteria, well, what scenarios do I have that apply to making payments in a retail system? Well, is it a situation where I'm in a brick and mortar establishment and I'm paying cash? Is it a situation where I'm paying by credit card? Is it a situation where I'm paying by check? Is it a situation where I'm not able to pay for it? Is a situation a scenario where I can only pay for part of the order? Is it a scenario where only part of the order is available? All of these are different scenarios around the idea of paying for an order. And those are the kinds of details that you would want to have in order for as a developer to be able to develop the functionality that says, okay, well, I've got all of these different scenarios that I need to accommodate. How am I going to accommodate each one of these scenarios? Do I need to accommodate all of these scenarios at this particular point in time? You could conceivably identify a specific scenario and say, you know what, this scenario I'm not going to be able to deal with at this particular point in time. I'm going to carve that out and basically rejuggle my backlog and say this specific scenario for this specific user story I'm not going to deal with right at this point in time. So I'm going to just carve that up and make it into um, two user stories. It might be effectively the same user story with different acceptance criteria. That's one of those kinds of things that you could do. Again, it's what works. It's what's going to work for you. If you say I have to carve it up, well, then I don't see any personal magic that says you can't have the same user story with multiple different sets of acceptance criteria. And you can make a legitimate decision to say, I'm going to I'm going to do all of this at the same time. I'm going to achieve all of these acceptance criteria at the same time, or I'm going to carve them up and I'm going to do them separate points in time. I don't see any magic about that. This is the level where you would want to be doing detailed kinds of things like screen mock-ups, wireframes, or report mock-ups, those kinds of things. Yeah, this is the level story elaboration. This is the technique that you would be using at this particular point in time to get the appropriate level of detail. And the ultimate goal for story elaboration is that the team should agree on, for a particular story, how will we determine we are done? What will it mean for us to be that we are done for this story? I can see a circumstance where you would like to be able to say we can all agree on a definition of done for user stories. Um, I could see where there would be a little bit of gray and fuzzy on that, where you could say, what is the definition of done for this specific user story? And the way I would go around that would be to say your general level of definition of done would be, we have resolved all of the outstanding issues related to this particular aspect. So if you said we will have we will have basically addressed all of the specifics of screen design, of data design for this particular for any user story. In order for us to consider it done, we will have valid acceptance criteria. We will have addressed user interface issues. We will have addressed system interface issues. We will have addressed data issues. Okay, there are four statements that comprise a definition of done. And in my mind, it would be acceptable to say not applicable if we're not dealing with something that requires this, if we're not dealing with a user story that or a functional requirement that deals with designing screens, then you can say, okay, we still have the checklist that says, have we considered screens? We have considered screens. Screens here are not applicable. So that definition of done, at a high level, you want to have it for all of your user stories. At a more detailed level, it's just to indicate that we have addressed this. We have addressed these concerns and we have resolved these concerns. Okay. Um, the idea of story elaboration, by its nature, it's because it's only done at the appropriate level of detail for when we're going to be working on a specific piece, a specific user story. It basically drives us to focus on what we're doing right now. We only have a certain list of things that we're going to be working on because we're doing things at the just in time for when we're going to be working on them. Theoretically, we're eliminating as much rework as possible. We're not doing things up front and then coming back to them at a later point in time and saying we have to re-verify and revalidate everything that we've done previously. And because we're choosing our stories based on their on the value that they're going to be provided, it means that the team will be focusing on the most valuable stories at the time that we're doing elaboration, because that's the way we've chosen the stories. Limitations. Um, I'm not sure that I see this as a limitation, but obviously, if we haven't done all of the work, we'll have to do the work again. If we kind of assume that we've done elaboration and haven't confirmed that we've done all of it, if we haven't confirmed that we've met the definition of that we understand the definition of done and we understand the definition of ready, and those are two separate things. Definition of ready being what does the delivery team need in order to be able to move forward with a specific item. Definition of done, what does the project team need in place in order to determine that an item is acceptable for completion. So they tie together. They do tie together. Story elaboration really probably approaches definition of ready as much as it approaches definition of done. Um, a story that is completely elaborated with its acceptance criteria would give you a story that's ready to be worked on, and also a story that is ready to be validated. And we can either do it too early or too late. That's just a possibility. Behavior-driven development. Okay. Behavior-driven development designed to basically focus on how the customers are going to be interacting with the solution in order to satisfy their needs, and it really is um, focusing on the idea that your customers are going to drive what you're developing based on what they're going to be doing with with what you're producing for them. This behavior-driven development kind of leads into test-driven development, where test-driven development, you're basically creating your testing requirements prior to creating your um, your code, that you're driving your code based on your tests, um, um, on your test cases. Um, this is again, if you have good acceptance criteria and you're focusing on developing according to your acceptance criteria, then you're really engaging in behavior or test-driven development. You have specific things that you're trying to address, and you know exactly how you're going to verify or validate that those things are being addressed, so you can really design and execute your code development based on those having that information. Um, this particularly here introduces the three amigos. The three amigos being a business user, a development person, a coder, and a tester, and the three of those people getting together to discuss exactly what's going to be done, as to how things are going to be put together. I would kind of argue that if you're going to use a technique like the Three Amigos, you might want to make it the Cuatro Amigos and include a business analyst in this, just to make sure that things are being that it's being facilitated properly, that the discussion is being focused, and that the outcome of the discussion is being documented to the level it needs to be documented. Um, They cite here the fact that behavior-driven development is really acceptance test-driven development, which is just slightly a little different from test-driven development. Test-driven development can be based on technical kinds of things. A quality assurance team could use test-driven development, or a development function that has a quality assurance team could use test-driven development, where the quality assurance people would be working based on their understanding of the requirements to create test cases for the developers. And that would be slightly different from acceptance test-driven development, since acceptance test-driven development is really about, does the solution allow me to do my job? Not, does the solution function correctly? Um, to do behavior or acceptance test driven development, obviously we want specific business scenarios. Those are the things that your stakeholders should be providing to you. That's the way you should be driving your development efforts. Gherkin syntax is another nice way, similar to what was done with user stories, in terms of doing test-driven development. Gherkin syntax. Um, I'm not sure how they came up with Gherkin, except for that there's a G that starts things. It has an H in the middle of it, and it has an N at the end. But that's, who knows how these things come up with. It's given a situation, or a situation, when something happens, then this is what I expect to see. And you can have multiples, and you can have ands. Um, there's there are specific scenarios so that you have only a single when event. So you can have a specific ATM example. Given I have enough money in my account and the ATM has enough cash available, there are two givens, two constraints that need to be in place in order for me to be able to successfully execute this particular test. When, and this is my event, when I request $20, then I receive $20, and my account balance is reduced by $20. That's a specific test that you can apply to your system. You can create something that says, okay, I have I have enough money in my account and there's enough cash available, and I put in a request, and the system responds to my request successfully, and all of my post conditions are met. I got my money and my account balance is reduced. However, for the same activity, you could have a scenario where I don't have sufficient funds. And in this particular case, because we were looking at two different constraints, um, here we're saying that I don't have enough money in my account, but the ATM has enough cash available. That's a different scenario than um, I have enough money in my account and there's no cash available in the ATM. That would be a third scenario. I guess you could say the fourth scenario would be I don't have enough money in my account and the ATM doesn't have enough cash. And you might have a different response for all of those things. Obviously, if I don't have enough money in my account and the ATM has cash, it's gonna say I don't have enough money in my account. If I have enough money in my account and there's no money in the cash machine, then the cash machine's response is going to be I don't have enough money, I don't have cash available to give to you. If both things are true, then somebody needs to make a decision. If I don't have enough money in my account and there's not enough money in the ATM, which takes precedence? What do I do? What is my decision? As a quote ATM, is it more important for me to inform my user you that you don't have money in your account, or that I don't have money in your to be able to give you? I don't know. Those are decisions that your stakeholders would have to make to say how does my system respond if both of these possibilities are true. Those are the kinds of things that you put together in terms of acceptance criteria and acceptance criteria testing. That's four separate scenarios that, as a developer, you could certainly write code for. As a tester, you could certainly say, okay, these are all the possible options, and this is how my system should respond under each of those options. Similar to what I said about multiple scenarios and carving out scenarios, you could say, well, under this circumstance, um, I might want to do something different, but I don't need to do something different. Uh, it could be the case, and I'm just doing this off the top of my head. Okay, in this particular circumstance, one of the responses of the system of my ATM system is if the ATM doesn't have cash to give to me as a user. My scenario says that as when I request $20, I don't get $20, and say I get an error message from the ATM that tells me as a user I don't have any cash. Okay. One of the other responses of the system might also be that as the ATM side, from the ATM side, if there's no cash and somebody requests cash, that the ATM sends an alert back to the bank that says this particular ATM is out of cash. Okay, that's a totally legitimate scenario. It's probably what happens. I don't know. Well, I don't know. Don't know that much about banking, but it might be the case that that's what they do. Well, if I have a scenario where both I don't have enough money in my account and my ATM doesn't have enough cash to do this, if I get a request for cash from somebody who doesn't have it, does my ATM still send a request back to the bank that says, by the way, I don't have any cash? That won't be visible to the user, but it is system functionality that happens because somebody requested cash, made a cash request, and the ATM could not fulfill that request based on its problems. Should it send a notification back to the basic branch about it. So you have all of these kinds of things that you could look at. And where I was going to with that is that you could carve out that scenario of uh, the the user doesn't have enough cash and the machine doesn't have enough cash, and you could say that if the user doesn't have enough cash, I don't assess whether or not the ATM has appropriate cash to give them. I just short circuit the transaction and say the transaction will be completed when I inform the user that I can't give them cash because they doesn't have enough in the account.
So just to add to that, I had this was my past background. Um, so basically, what the system does is first thing we want to do an account verification on the customer to see or send a balance inquiry message. It's a non-financial message to the customer's account to verify that he has funds.
Yep,
That's the first and most important step before every other thing executes. If we confirm that the customer has funds, then of course we also need to check if the ATM has enough money.
yep,
If the ATM doesn't have enough money, it triggers a notification to branch managers letting them know that there's no ATM, so that it doesn't even make any attempt to pay the
yep,
customer.
yep.
All right.
Yeah. So that's precisely the scenario that I was talking about. You have a response to the customer and you have a response to the branch manager. And as a part of your development, you could say, I'm only going to, for whatever reason, in this particular iteration, I'm only going to deal with the notification to the customer. I don't want to take the time to deal with, or I don't have the time to deal with the notification to the branch manager or to whoever. So you could carve those out. It would still be a part of the user story that says, or as a user, I want to be able to request money from my bank account so that I can go out to dinner with my friends. That's the overall user story. But as you carve that down into what's the underlying functionality, you have different pieces of that, and you can say, okay, well, I can either choose to address all of them at the same time, or I can carve it out and do it in different pieces. So that supports absolutely, what you're saying absolutely supports what I'm saying here about being able to break things up. Okay, good. Advantages to doing this. Well, again, you're focusing on uh, doing this from a user's perspective, from a customer's perspective, so that you want to be speaking in terms, and you are speaking in terms that those people will understand, that the business people will understand, and yet at the same time you're giving enough information to the actual developers that they can translate that information into something that will technically achieve will respond to those scenarios appropriately. Um, it's specific. These doing these acceptance test criteria, developing these acceptance criteria are very specific. If they're too abstract, they're not going to be useful, and so you focus things on basically concrete examples. Um, it maps very well to technical test driven development, so that's good. It's it helps if we're doing this, it helps support automation because particularly in an agile environment, you need to be sure that you can automate as much of your testing as possible, because you're going to be consistently basically layering on your product. And so you always want to, when you're layering on a product, you always want to make sure that what you've done in the current iteration doesn't break anything that you did in the previous iteration. That implies that you're going to have to run your tests, run your verifications and your validations on previous functionality as you're adding new functionality. The only way to do that realistically, well, not the only way to do that, but the best way to do that realistically is to be able to automate as much of this testing as is possible, and having consistent syntax that you use for developing your tests certainly goes a long way towards that. Okay. There are tools that can help you to do these things. I'm not, you know, um, not necessarily familiar with a lot of the tools that do this, but I certainly know that things like HPALM allows you to automate and reuse tests. I would assume I would assume a tool like Jira, um, if it applies to testing, would also would do this. And I'm sure that there are other testing tools that would help you to be able to reuse this information and verify that you've got it. I know ALM does this kind of good stuff. A long-term documentation of the systems. If you're writing all of these things out, you should preserve them. You can and should preserve them so that they can be reused. Um, Going right back to what I just said, if you're layering your solution, then you're going to have to go back to it. So you really are going to need to preserve these things because you're going to have to re-execute them all the time. Um, it's it's a good way of documenting things, and you get the this syntax as doing acceptance criteria for your user stories. Possible disadvantages, well, you can always miss something. That's always the case. Um, if you get, oops, sorry, I did that again. If you get too many of them, it can be hard to track and manage them, and it does, you do need to maintain them. Reviews. As a part of the Agile process, we should always be looking for feedback from people. Um, Reviews can be formal reviews or informal reviews. I would argue that you should probably have informal reviews as much as possible during your iterations, and then potentially have a more formal review or a formal review at the end of your iteration to reconfirm everything that you've done. Again, this is the process. While you're doing it, you want close communication between your stakeholders. You want them to be sort of hands-on in terms of your development and confirming things and working with your delivery team. But then at the end, when you're putting it all together and saying, okay, we are finished, you want to have a major review just to confirm that everyone is comfortable with this. If you've done informal reviews during much of your iteration, depending on the number of stakeholders, the different stakeholders that you have involved, you might have a differing level of comfort with what's been done. Since you're not going to have multiple or likely you won't have multiple stakeholders involved in the same parts of the delivery cycle. I'm thinking of multiple users of the same functionality. You might want to have a more formal review at the end of the cycle, where you bring in a larger population of people to see what's going on, instead of a representative user from a specific area. You might have multiple users from that specific area, and in that case, you would be relying on the representative user to have communicated a lot with their entire user group. Uh, if the groups are too large there, you run the risk of somebody coming up with an outlier at the last minute. But probably better that you have that happening than that you deliver this solution for use by the users and then find out that there was something that was completely overlooked, or overlooked enough that it would cause significant discomfort for your users. Again, um, the strengths of review, obviously, if you're reviewing on a regular basis, theoretically, you're getting the input that you need to ensure that what you're doing continues on the right path and continues to be correct. You can do these lightweight and informal. They don't need to be formally done. Um, you can and should be doing them hands-on with your users. Um, since you're doing them with the understanding that this is all work in progress, you can get them involved as early as possible, and certainly in the delivery horizon, it's helping you to maintain your contact with your stakeholder population. The possible limitations of doing reviews are that you just get too much information. Um, Depending on the number of people that you have involved in it and their understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, you could get too much information and it could become confusing. And the one possibility here, which is always a possibility with project work, is that depending on the level of your stakeholder, the likelihood is that the stakeholder who is going to be involved on a day-to-day basis with your solution, is going to be at a lower level than the person who's also ultimately responsible for for its approval, and so we run two risks. One risk that you run is that the person at a higher level will have a different view than the person at the lower level, and the other one is that you could get into a situation of what I would call decision paralysis, where the person at the lower level is afraid to make a decision or is not empowered to make a decision. So those are things you just need to be aware of. Um, in terms of the elements for review, obviously you need to be sure that the user stories you have the appropriate level of detail for your user stories so that it makes sense to work on them and ergo to review them. Already went over the invest criteria. It's another mnemonic here. I'm not sure this one, if it makes sense to you, use it. Any of these mnemonics, if they make sense, use them. If invest is certainly something that you will see somewhere along the line in the agile environment. I don't know about in OPA, but it's another uh, mnemonic to help you understand whether your user stories are ready. The backlog needs to be maintained, obviously, and you need to be looking at the output of reviews, the information that you get from your reviews, in order to help you to identify any particular problems or roadblocks during the current work, and help you to clear those roadblocks. And user learning. I'm not sure why we seem to be into the application of the agile principles to not sure why this would be here too. Well, that's it. I wonder whether I missed something. Nope, nope. Yep, interesting. Okay, that's pretty much it for here.
Thanks, Tom.
You know, yep, yep. That's pretty much everything that I have to say. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns? Any other way that I can help you before we sign off?
Yeah, from my side, I'm good. I've asked most of my questions during the session.
Okay. You have my contact information because I sent you guys emails, so you have my contact information. I am available if you have any questions, if anything comes up while you're doing your studies, while you're prepping for this, or honestly, from my perspective, at any point in time, if you feel that there's anything that I can, do to help you in your career going forward, I'm totally open and available. I will answer your questions. It may take me a little while to do that, depending on what else I have going on in my life. But I certainly, this it means a lot to me to help people in the BA environment to do their job. And so, if there's any way I can ever do that, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will do what I can. Anything else, Leon?
Thank you so much.
Very good. Okay, if you guys are good, I will. What will I do here? I will look at this. Yeah, that's what I want to do. Well, I'll just pause